Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 1056 for May 12th, 2024. Coming up in a few minutes.
It's that moment when you know your eyes open and you think, wow, that's just really extraordinary. And then start to go back into time and think, for most people, and not me, but for a lot of the people who you talk to, Mark, this is older than they are by quite some way. And that's quite sort of miraculous, isn't it?
That's Rebecca Jago, the managing director of The Last Drop Distillers, talking about one of the new releases in their 2024 collection, a 55-year-old Tom Tool single malt. I'll talk with Rebecca about that and the rest of the collection, along with the difficulty in finding rare casks of whiskey to bottle these days. That's just ahead on WhiskyCast In-Depth. I'll also have the What I'm Tasting This Week department, Behind the Label, and much more. The news is next on this week's WhiskyCast.
Hey everyone, it's me, Gabriel Cardarello with yours, and I'm here to introduce you to something very special. We've gone and blended the time-honored whiskey craftsmanship of Scotland with the whiskey-making finesse of Japan. And let me tell you, it's something truly remarkable. More on that in a minute.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
A thoughtful gift is hard work. What you need is a go-to multi-purpose gift for all occasions. A bottle of Redbreast can say, enjoy every minute, they grow up so fast. Oh. And equally nails, apologies for the back pain, I should have just hired a moving company.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
Let's get started with the week's news. It's brought to you by the Dalmore. More labor trouble at Heaven Hill. The union representing bottling hall workers in Bardstown, Kentucky, has filed a complaint with the National Labor Relations Board, accusing Heaven Hill of reclassifying jobs to take them out of the contract. Heaven Hill executives told the Louisville Courier-Journal that that's not the case. The company is offering 14 senior bottling hall workers the opportunity to take early retirement packages. Leaders of United Food and Commercial Workers Local 23D say they won't agree to discuss Heaven Hill's plans unless they're part of contract negotiations. The last time the two sides sat down to discuss a new contract 3 years ago, it led to a month-long strike. The current contract still has 2 years left to go. Meanwhile, workers at Whyte and Mackay distilleries in Scotland are in the middle of a strike vote. The GMB Scotland members rejected a contract offer in February, and the strike vote runs through May 24th. The action affects workers at the Dalmore, Invergordon, and Tamnavulin distilleries, and we should note that Whyte and Mackay is a sponsor of WhiskyCast. In other news, longtime Balblair distillery manager John MacDonald has retired after 18 years at the distillery. John rose up through the ranks at Glenmorangie to assistant distillery manager before leaving in 2006 to become Balblair's manager. David Rogerson is leaving his post at International Beverages Speyburn Distillery to move up to Balblair and take over for John. John has been a good friend of WhiskyCast over the years, and we wish him well in his retirement. The American Distilling Institute has handed out its annual International Spirits Competition Awards. Heaven Hill took Best of Class among American whiskeys for its Larceny Barrel Proof Batch A124, while Israel's Ruach Distillery was named Best of Class for international whiskeys for its Ascent Single Malt. Nelson's Greenbrier Distillery won Best in Class for sourced whiskeys with its Nelson Brothers Straight Rye Whiskey. Scotch whiskey sales are forecast to reach a record of $15 billion in sales annually by 2028. That's according to a new report from the consulting company Technavio, which bases that estimate on the increase in sales of high-end Scotch whiskies. The U.S. is the largest market for Scotch whiskey by value, and a new report from the Wine and Spirits Wholesalers of America shows spirits sales fell by 2.7% for the year ending March 31st. Data from the WSWA's SipSource tracking tool shows spirits sales fell 5.2% from January through March from the previous year as inflation cut into consumer spending. SipSource analysts forecast spirits sales will likely break out of their slump by the end of the year. Meanwhile, Texas's Milam and Green Distillery has released its first bottled-in-bond bourbon. The whiskey was distilled at Bardstown Bourbon Company in Kentucky and matured there for 4.5 years before being shipped to Texas for bottling. Master blender and CEO Heather Green explains why they didn't make the whiskey on their pot still in Blanco.
I worked in Scotland for many years, and the type of grains and taste that is, but then you have like the column stills in Kentucky and the tradition. And it's like, oh, I like that too. And so when we kind of started Milam and Green, I was like, can we find a partner that really allows us to go in hands-on? And I think that for me, it was really important to be able to go there and make it with Marlene and have our own grains and have our yeast. It can't be a call-in. It can't be just like, kind of a distant process for us. And so when we started doing this and thinking about it, we went to Bardstown Bourbon Company before this was like a massive thing for them. In fact, this is the first time they used malted rye, and we partnered with them, with the team there, and Milam and Green went, and I like to think of it as cooking in other people's kitchens. So I want to make sure that people understand that, like, we, from the very beginning, we went into that kitchen and we nurtured this whiskey.
Milam and Green's bottled-in-bond bourbon will retail for $64.99 a bottle. I'll have my tasting notes for it later on. Irish Distillers has released a new edition in Redbreast's American Oak series. Redbreast Missouri Oak takes the standard Redbreast profile and finishes it in virgin Missouri Oak for 10 months. It's a U.S. exclusive bottling that will retail for $199.99 a bottle. We'll get word this coming week on the final edition in the Dream Cask series when it's released on World Whiskey Day this coming Saturday. Rosebank Distillery has released the final expression in its Legacy series. It's a 32-year-old single malt from some of the last remaining stocks laid down before the distillery closed in 1993. The release comes just ahead of the distillery's reopening to the public this summer. It'll carry a recommended retail price of £2,100 at the Rosebank website when it goes on sale Monday. Lochley Distillery is wrapping up its seasonal trilogy with the new Sowing Edition Third Crop. It's matured entirely in first fill ex-bourbon barrels and is available for £51.95 a bottle. Nevada's Frey Ranch Distillery has released a limited edition 100% wheat whiskey to mark 10 years of distilling. It's a single-barrel bottling at cask strength that's available through the Frey Ranch website for $114 a bottle. And finally, Rare Hair Spirits has teamed up with Tasmania's Hellier's Road Distillery to release Tempest. It's a 20-year-old Australian single malt that was finished for 3 years in port wine casks. It's available for $999 a bottle at the Rare Hair Spirits website and select U.S. retailers. You can keep up on the latest whiskey news all week long at WhiskyCast.com and in the WhiskyCast community app. The news is brought to you by the Dalmore.
Hello, Richard Patterson here, Master Distiller, Master Blender for the Dalmore. Whenever the team and I are in the world sharing our exceptional single malt, we like to keep in touch with Mark Gillespie and the latest news from WhiskyCast.
Let's check the calendar now and see what's happening around the world of whiskey. Benny's in Chicago is hosting Compass Box whiskey maker James Saxon for a tasting this Friday night. That's also the night for the Whiskey X Brooklyn and the start of Whiskey Live Dublin, which wraps up on Saturday. Saturday brings us a Glendalough Irish whiskey tasting at Julio's Liquors in Westboro, Massachusetts. And our guest from last week, Brian Nation, will be at Julio's for a Keeper's Heart tasting on the 22nd. The Campbellton Malts Festival is May 21st and 22nd in Campbellton, Scotland. The Brandy Library in New York City hosts a Scotch Past and Present tasting on the 21st, and Whiskey Fete 2024 is on the 23rd in Montreal. If you're organizing a whiskey event, let us know about it, and we'll add it to the calendars at WhiskyCast.com and the WhiskyCast community app.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Kentucky and Ireland have plenty in common. 2 homes of horse racing. Bluegrass music is said to have Irish roots. Okay, it's not the longest list. But the Redbreast Kentucky Oak Edition only strengthens the bond. Finished in sustainably sourced Kentucky oak for a captivating nose and round taste. I see a triple crown in this thoroughbred's future.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you this week by Lagavulin and the Classic Malts lineup. 15 years ago, James Espey and Tom Jago founded the Last Drop Distillers with an eye to bottling rare parcels of whiskey and other spirits. Today, the company is owned by Sazerac and has just released its 2024 collection of 2 vintage single malts and an unusual Infinity Blend rum. Tom's daughter, Rebecca Jago, now runs the Last Drop, and we connected on a Zoom call the other day. Well, I do remember talking with James Espey and your father, Tom Jago, 15 years ago when they first started the Last Drop Distillers. It has been a long and interesting journey since then, hasn't it?
It certainly has, Mark, and one that I wouldn't have missed for the world. I think I've been involved peripherally since the beginning, but very, very much involved for the last 10 years. And I think probably for everybody involved in the business, both inside and out, it has turned into something way beyond what either James or my dad expected when they went off in search of that first parcel of whiskey that became our first release.
How so?
Well, if I'm completely honest, I would say that when they had the original idea of going and finding some exceptional whiskey to bottle and call it the Last Drop, I think it was an idea that they wanted to bring to life and prove they could do it. I don't think they had a vision for a long-term business. I think, given their ages, 65 and 82 when they started the business, this was like a pipe dream that they were going to bring to life. And I think in many ways, the pivotal moment for the future of the business was actually their second release, because not only was there a second release, but it wasn't a whiskey, it was a cognac. And that really, those 2 releases set us on the path that I'm very proud to be part of today, which is our ability to curate and to create spirits from across so many different categories. And that what they have in common is both the quality of them, but also the passion with which we find and bottle them, which was there from the very beginning. So I suppose that's what we're celebrating this year is that passion and that desire for something truly remarkable.
You just released releases 34, 35, and 36, the 2024 collection. 2 single malts and a rum.
Yeah.
Is this the first time you've released a single malt?
No, very much not. I mean, I was actually looking through our releases, and our first ever single malt was a tiny release of 112 bottles in 2015, and that was a 1967 Glengarry single malt. And that really came about because Glengarry, when it was acquired by Beam Suntory, completely changed the profile of their distillate. They went from being a lightly peated Scotch to one without any peat influence at all. So this tiny remnant was surplus to the business's requirements, and we were fortunate enough to be able to bottle it. So that was our first, and then there was a long gap until we released our trilogy of the Glenrothes single malts.
Oh, yes, I remember those now.
2018, 19, 20. So not many, but I think we can say today that we've bottled every kind of Scotch whiskey in, from blends to single malts, single grains, and indeed blended grains as well.
And you've really become known as a blending house thanks to Colin Scott, your master blender.
I hope so, because it was a very fortuitous opportunity to ask Colin to join us, and I think we all felt there was something. I wouldn't go so far as to say missing, but there was perhaps a little gap where that sort of expertise could provide us with a bit more authority, a bit more gravitas, if you like, in that we had bottled, as you know, several blends. They were all excellent blends that we had that had lived, if you like, for a long time as blends before we bottled them. But we also had quite a significant maturing inventory, and we did not have the expertise to assess that and decide what might work within that. I've just seen your cat.
Yeah, the cat makes an appearance from time to time.
Christy knows I love a cat. I love cats, so that's made me very happy. And the timing was just real serendipity, because Colin was just retiring from Shivers Brothers in the summer of 2020, which is when we started to have this discussion about whether there was an opportunity to bring somebody on board. And obviously Colin's long-term relationship with James and my dad from the days when James was CEO of Shivers Brothers meant that he was a very obvious choice and that they had the connection. But I don't think I anticipated quite how joyful the friendship has been for me over the last 4 years, and how much I've learned just by listening to Colin, by tasting with him and watching how he goes about things. But also because Colin's joining The Last Drop is also what motivated us to form the Assembly, which plays the same sort of role in a much wider scope of categories. So we now have our Last Drop Assembly, which has Drew Mayville, Denis Lauratat from Sazerac's Cognac operation, Michael de Souza from Paul John, plus Richard Seal from Foursquare and Louise McGuan from JJ Corrie. And we have just announced that Helen Mulholland, who was Master Blender for Bushmills and is now the Master Blender at Lochgill, which Sazerac acquired a couple of years ago, has also joined us. So, the wealth of expertise, knowledge and experience in one room when those 7 people are together is not to be sniffed at. I feel like the real imposter in the room when I'm with them.
How so? I mean, you've been doing this for a long time now.
I'll tell you, Mark, the one thing I know I can't do is blend, because every time I've tried, I get sort of I'm not very good at it. I know I've tasted some outstanding blends, but I haven't ever created one myself.
The deal with Sazerac several years ago really put you on a solid business footing, right?
Definitely. I think it was all quite unexpected. I think James and Beanie actually went to see Mark Brown to talk about distribution in the US. And Mark, who sees things differently from most other people, let's just say that, and can see things very creatively, felt there was an opportunity for The Last Drop that would be far more fruitful, positive, and exciting if we became part of the Sazerac family rather than just signing up as a brand to be distributed. And I think the big impact that's had on us is the passion that the Sazerac team have brought to that relationship, which is always different. They know that we're part of them, we're part of this extraordinary family of brands, and a very different one from some of the more mass volume brands, but equally precious, or maybe differently precious. And it's been, as you say, it's certainly put us on a very sound financial footing. But I think even more than that, it has brought our brand to a whole new level of new audiences through the support of the Sazerac sales team. And, if I were going to do one shout out, it would be to all of them, because I see what they bring to us.
What do you think the business would have looked like today had Sazerac not gotten involved several years ago?
That's a really, really, it's such an open question, and it's not one I can actually answer, but I can speculate on, because at the time we sold the business, which was in 2016, My father was very frail, and James, I think, was getting tired of trying to run a business largely on his own. That was really the reason why Beanie and I joined the business in 2014, was to give it a bit more structure and a bit more organizational efficiencies, if you like. But I think it would have been hard to keep going because effectively James was bankrolling the business in terms, not of our profitability, but in terms of our ability to acquire stock. So that was a huge change, was being able to future-proof the business through the acquisition of inventory. And that remains true to this day.
Let's talk about the 2024 collection. First of all, the 40-year-old Auchentoshan.
Yeah.
This 40-year-old Auchentoshan is a stunner.
It is a stunner. You've tasted it already, I take it.
I took a small sip.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. I think it's a real stunner, and I think it's possible on paper that it might be overshadowed by the third of these releases. But in the glass, it's such a thing of beauty that I think it more than stands up to scrutiny. But so, what do we know about this? Auchentoshan is the distillery in Scotland that triple distills, which may or may not lead people to believe that maybe the Irish did invent distilling and that they brought it to Scotland along with I can't remember who the saint was, but St. Augustine maybe. But either way, I've been fortunate enough to visit Auchentoshan with its three stills, and I've tasted new make, and I've now been fortunate enough to taste the 40-year-old result of that distillation process. I think it's so elegant, it's so floral and fresh in a way that really belies the 40 years. And I think 40 years is very old for Auchentoshan spirit. And we couldn't have bottled it. I mean, we didn't want to bottle it any sooner, but by the time we did bottle it, there was an incredibly small quantity left. I mean, 72 bottles out of a barrel is not a lot. So very glad to have got to it when we did, and very glad that at least a very few people will get to taste it.
And then release 35 is a rum, an Infinium blend.
Yeah. So how do you describe something that we had to call it the product of the United Kingdom because the raw ingredients, if you like, come from so many different countries, it would be impossible to say. But essentially, there's a company in Liverpool who are a big old and rare rum broker. And every year they have one barrel into which they empty all their duty suspended samples. And one of the reasons for doing this, the main reason for doing this, is that in the UK, you have to account for every drop of duty suspended liquid. And if you can't account for it, you have to pay the duty on it. So once they've drawn samples and the ones they haven't shipped out to customers, they just pour them all back into this one barrel. And then on the last day of the year, they seal it. And that becomes that year's duty suspended Infinity blend. And I was fortunate enough to go visit this company and taste this. And they were telling me that this was the one from the year 2000. And they'd actually named it after their longest serving member of staff. And that nobody could possibly have known that this was going to be utterly delicious because they would have done it anyway, and they do it every year anyway. But somehow this blend of hundreds of different rum samples from hundreds of different distilleries just turned into something magical. And I was blown away when I tasted it and was sort of, saying, well, can we have this? And there was this sort of, this element of surprise for them, because this is the perfect example of serendipity, isn't it? Nobody could possibly have said this would be good. This wasn't a master blender's creation. This was luck, accident, and happenstance.
It sounds like something that would be fun to try with whiskey samples.
Oh, well, I'm sure people do. Don't you think at the end of I look around my desk and think, I could knock all of these together. But I think it was also the opportunity to put them all into a barrel the influence of wood can never be underestimated in what it does to flavour of spirit. And when we talk about, when we talk about spirits being made of 3 ingredients or 4 ingredients, the fourth is always the wood, really, if it's matured in wood, because that's where so much of the flavour as well as the colour comes from. So I think a desk blend would always be different from a blend that went into a barrel.
And let's talk about the release 36, the 55-year-old Tom and Tool.
Well,
this is a special whiskey, isn't it?
It's a very special whiskey, because it tastes fantastic. And that is always going to be the number one criterion for us, because if it doesn't taste fantastic, it doesn't matter how great the backstory is. It doesn't matter. And as you know, Mark, because we only do this one thing, admittedly across several categories, we can't fail. We can't afford to get it wrong, because if we did, that's sort of the end of our reputation, and we live or die by the strength of our reputation. So Tom and Tool, very young distillery. In fact, it was barely 4 years old when they distilled what we've now bottled we bottled it in 2023. So I like the juxtaposition of a very young distillery doing something quite new and innovative, and our bottling our oldest single malt to date. 55 years is extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, I know there are much older single malts, but it's still an extraordinary exercise. And I think it achieved that great age through really judicious racking and re-racking. As I think we say in the tasting book, this is the combination of several hogsheads and butts, and that is why we have the volume we have from something that is so old. And it was finished in an Amoroso butt, which has given even more depth to an already quite highly sherried whiskey. But I think, as with everything we release, it's ultimately how delicious it is that counts the most. And as I'm certain you and I have discussed before, you shouldn't have to be an expert to enjoy and be delighted by the taste of what's in your glass, because if you did have to be, we'd all be out of a job, because there aren't enough of us to drink all the whiskey or rum or whatever that is produced. But I do think it's that moment when your eyes open and you think, wow, that's just really extraordinary. And then start to go back into time and think, for most people, and not me, but for a lot of the people who you talk to, Mark, this is older than they are by quite some way. And that's quite sort of miraculous, isn't it? This was distilled in 1968 when the Beatles were going. And I mean, I haven't got my notes with me, but there was an awful lot going on in the world 55 years ago. Yes. that it's truly remarkable to just look back and think, wow, that's incredible. And that this whiskey speaks of that time in a way that you can't imagine. It's like this sort of lovely link between the past and the present.
It took guts to put that old whiskey into an Amoroso butt for 20 months.
Yeah. Fortunately, it wasn't me making that decision. This was done by the then owners of the cask, and they were taking advice from somebody who knows a great deal both about wood and about whiskey, and who didn't feel this was an unnecessary risk. I think there was a lot of consideration about how do we preserve these perhaps half-full hogsheads and butts. We need to do something that's going to give them a chance to live, and I think he did an outstanding job, and I'm thrilled that we are the ones who get to put our name on the bottle.
Are you still finding rare parcels of whiskey? Are they still out there?
Well, yes, I would say they are. I think we're going through quite an interesting time in the world of whiskey casks and cask sales. I think there's perhaps a correction coming. As you know, as we all know, both barrels and bottles of whiskey have reached unimaginable prices in recent years. And I think a lot of people have invested, whether wisely or not. There are still barrels of whiskey, and there always will be, but I think it's getting harder to find those real gems. And I think, to go back to why we have Colin in the assembly, that's part of it, because to have a skill set like that, to be able to play, if you like, with raw ingredients and make them taste better is a real asset in a time where you may not come across that next magical cask.
Are you having trouble sourcing casks when you have to compete with investors who want to find those old casks and make money off of them?
Yeah, we are. I mean, I think that one of the things that has certainly happened over the last 15 years is that we have built a small but quite pertinent reputation as people who, I think, we're very principled in what we do. We will always pay a fair price, but we pay a fair price if the product is worth it. So and again, we've certainly touched on this in the past. The name is not ultimately what matters. What we're after is the quality of the liquid, and so we will be very, very judicious in what we buy, because as I've said to you, we can't afford to get it wrong. We have the advantage that blenders can make things much better than the sum of their parts, but we need the quality of the initial cast to be pretty good as well. So we're very selective.
I think that does it. Anything else you can add I didn't ask about?
I don't know. What can we talk about, Mark? We could talk about possibly what's next. We could talk about...
Yeah, what is next?
What is next? Well, I think there's always a moment, and it happens at least once a year, if not twice a year, every year, when we ask, what's next? What's coming? And as we touched on at the beginning of the call, our ability to future-proof is made far greater by our ownership and the ability to source for the future. It has also obviously made a huge difference to the range of categories that we can play in, most notably, of course, American whiskey. And obviously 2022 was the year we released our second signature blend, the first one having been Colin Scott's 50-year-old, which was the Drew Mayville signature blend of Kentucky straight whiskies. And that was a phenomenal success for us, and also a real step into the unknown, because it was our first non-age statement whiskey, but came with the stamp of authority of Drew's name and also the provenance of the whiskies, which were all from Buffalo Trace. So that was a big step for us, and I think it's given us some confidence to explore categories more and to look at what we do within those categories. So I would say that my dream is that we find something in the world of agave spirits. We haven't yet, but that's something I would really, really love to find, and to keep on doing what we do as well as we possibly can.
Thanks to Rebecca Jago for joining us on this week's WhiskyCast In-Depth. It's brought to you by Lagavulin, an award-winning single malt scotch from Islay, world-renowned for its balanced smoky and peaty taste. Discover Lagavulin's full lineup at malts.com. Let's start off the What I'm Tasting This Week department with the new Last Drop single malts, starting with that Auchentoshan 40-year-old, release number 34 for the Last Drop. It's bottled at 44.8% ABV, and the nose has touches of Christmas cake, black cherries, hints of hazelnut, spices, and oak. The taste has notes of black cherries, raisin bread, soft spices, a hint of oak, and dried flowers, while the finish is long and gentle with hints of licorice and raisins. I'm scoring the Last Drop Auchentoshan 40-year-old a 95. Next up, the Last Drop Tom & Toole 55-year-old. It's bottled at 41.7% ABV. The nose is rich with touches of plums, raisins, dried fruits, and a hint of toffee. The taste has notes of ripe fruits, candy apples, baking spices, toffee, and sweet oak. The finish, long and smooth with touches of dried flowers, oak, and a hint of apples. I'm scoring the last drop Tom and Tool 55-year-old a 95. By the way, that 22-year-old Infinity rum was a cracker as well, but we don't share tasting notes for rums here on WhiskyCast. Now, let's look at the new Royal Salute 21-year-old Miami Polo edition. This one is bottled at 40% ABV. The nose is fruity and floral with tropical fruits, ginger, coconut, and dried flowers. The taste is full of ginger, coconut, apricots, mango, papaya, and honey, and the finish is long with tropical fruits and a hint of ginger. I wish this one had been bottled at a higher strength, but it's good just as it is. I'm scoring the Royal Salute Miami Polo Edition a 93. And finally, let's take a look at the Milam & Green Bottled in Bond bourbon I mentioned during the news. Of course, it's bottled at 50% ABV, and the nose is complex with touches of red apples, caramel, dried fruits, maple, oak tannins, tobacco, and a hint of leather. The taste is thick, chewy, and spicy with notes of cherries, black pepper, a hint of cinnamon, and touches of honey underneath. The finish is long with gently fading spices. It's an excellent bourbon. I'm scoring the Milam & Green Bottled in Bond bourbon a 94. I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of 3,700 different whiskeys from all over the world. Check it out this week at whiskycast.com.
Jurors has truly been innovative in perfecting cask finishing, which has led to exceptional expressions of our craftsmanship. This extra step allows our whiskey to further mature in carefully selected casks and marks the final stage of our double aging process, or in Jurors' case, our double aging method, resulting in unique, indulgent tasting experiences. The new Jurors Double 21-year Mizunara oak cask finish undergoes a meticulous 4-stage aging process, including being finished in sought-after Japanese Mizunara oak casks. Crafting these casks is challenging due to the non-straight growth of Mizunara oak, and it takes 200 years for these trees to reach full potential. The result, a masterfully balanced whiskey with notes of sandalwood, coconut, and creamy vanilla, to name a few. And while it's not the easiest to find, it's an unmissable experience.
Let's open up the WhiskyCast community app and see what people are talking about this week. Our community segment is presented by Waterford Whiskey. Ken Goldenberg from Orange County, California, posted this comment in the app this week. I was looking at the Jack Daniel's Bonded series to see if my local Bevmo carried it. They do, but they are bottled in 700 ml bottles. I know this size bottle has become legal in the U.S., but I hope this is not a downward spiral where we will be paying more for less. First it was coffee years ago shrinking the size of the can, then Hillshire Farms shrank their sausage, that one hurt, and now Jack Daniel's? Yikes! Well, it's called shrinkflation, charging the same price for a smaller size package. And yes, it is becoming commonplace in the whiskey industry now that the U.S. has legalized 700 ml bottles. On the flip side, Pete at Whiskey Ranked pointed out that, and I'm quoting now, the upside is that we may see a wider array of whiskeys in the United States because bottlers will no longer need to bottle 750 mLs specifically for the U.S. market. That point is true. For instance, Nick Neon's Annabelle Thomas told us several weeks ago that she would not have been able to export her whiskeys to the U.S. had the rule not been changed to allow for 700 ml sizes. If you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, share it with us in the WhiskyCast community app. Download it today from the iOS and Google Play app stores and join the conversation. You can also reach us on X, Threads, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com. Our community segment is presented by Waterford Whiskey on the web at waterfordwhiskey.com.
Trevor Harris, Alan Ross and Amy Jackson, Pat and Dennis Booth, Alan Mooney, John MacDonald. Just a few of the growers who helped to make us the biggest distillers of organic whiskey in the world. Waterford Whiskey, the most naturally flavoursome single malt.
Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and people who make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Balcones Distilling. I've shared this story before, but with the news that John MacDonald has retired from Balblair Distillery, it's worth mentioning how he tricked me into tasting one of the worst whiskies I've ever tried. About 10 years ago, I was visiting Balblair with a group of writers, and we did an online Twitter tasting from the distillery's conference room. When we were done on Twitter, John said the magic words, "I've got something else I want you to taste." We were thinking, well, maybe something really special. Not quite. John passed around the Glencairns and we started nosing them. A little briny, but not out of character. The first and only sip, though, was completely atrocious. That's right, it was the infamous Fischke, an ex-Brookladdy single cask finished in a herring barrel, the work of one Klaus Pinkernell at what was then Cadenheads in Austria. Now it's Pinkernell's Whiskey Mart. You can hear the story behind that whiskey in episode 696 from June of 2018 in the archives at WhiskyCast.com. John told me several years later that, quote, "It was a bit cruel, but it was for my amusement." Glad you were amused, John. Enjoy your retirement. If you have something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Balcones Distilling, the original Texas whiskey at the forefront of the American single malt movement, exploring place and provenance with unique style whiskeys, ranging from the award-winning Texas One and Lineage American single malts to their Baby Blues straight corn whiskey and Texas Rye bottled in bond. Discover whiskey from a new perspective at balconesdistilling.com. That's all for this episode of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, the whiskey photo of the week, and, of course, a complete archive of past episodes going all the way back to 2005. Get in touch with us on X, Threads, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast, or you can use the WhiskyCast community app. Download it today from the Apple and Google App Stores. Our email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Ever go out drinking with a peacock? Always the same. Few too many, tail feathers come out, drinks get knocked over, bartender's not happy, night's over before it started. All I'm saying is, don't be the peacock in your group.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
Dewar's Double 21-year-old Mizunara Oak Cask Finish is like a worldly whiskey adventure you simply can't miss. Courtesy of your friends at Dewar's. Savor it responsibly. Copyright 2024, Dewar's Blended Scotch Whiskey, 46% alcohol by volume.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2024, and comes to you from the charming yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.